Pardon me, if you could just swing the chair back.
Oh, yeah. Sure. Yeah, no, not at all.
There was somebody sitting in this one.
No, I know, it's in here, I need to get the answer.
Hey, I'm glad you're doing this. Is this on a Zoom or you're just taping?
We're live streaming currently on YouTube. So I get to take questions at the same time. I love it. You're going to have a lot of questions. The future is now. I wish I know.
Well, maybe you'll be able to catch all the violence.
Oh yeah, there we go. I know. It's the format. I can't wait for the carnage. I'm sure the chat is too.
I'm Johnny. This is Jennifer.
Can you not hear it from outside? That's what I have. So what? We would have had to know if it was going to be like such a massive turnout, I guess, that we would need the chairs. Yes, but not easily.
I expect to stay till the end.
Where are you going? If you want to sit up front, you can.
Can we get in?
Yeah.
There we
Go
go.
around here, it's fine.
Oh, thank you. Hi. Hi. Good. How are you? Hi.
You know, there's nothing like being unopposed.
I got here early because I don't have that No, I don't know why. She's still sending emails. My daughter should
has made it in, found a seat. Thank you for being here this evening. We've been requested by both towns to come out and provide an update on this project to the communities.
Ma'am, we can barely hear you.
I'm doing my best. I was told there's good projection. So I'm Jennifer Reczek. I'm the project manager for the Department of Transportation. I have our chief environmental manager here, John Evans. We've also got our construction administrator in the audience, as well as up here in the corner, Jeff Potter, and the Vermont Agency of Transportation project manager, Gary LaRoche. So this is a bi-state project. Most of the Connecticut River bridges fall.
Please, can you turn up the volume?
She's just talking. She has to just project her voice.
No mic.
Not quickly or easily in this space.
So this was the suggestion from the communities for where to hold the meeting due to the number of people. So we are limited by the facility that's here. So I'll do the best I can to project as much as I can so that everyone can hear. There's some seats here.
The sound is better up front. If somebody can't hear you, can come up and take this seat.
There's also a
There's a
seat
seat
right here
here.
too.
See a couple right here. So we are here, I think there's been a lot of discussion in the communities. There's been a lot of information circulated that is not necessarily factual. So what we're here today to do is to really provide, I look at this as more of an educational opportunity. This project is in construction, the contract has been awarded. So that's sort of where we are in the project process. So the things that we're hoping to cover today, first of all, where do our projects come from? How did this become a project in the first place? Secondly, what does the project development process look like, specifically for this project? How was it developed and how were the decisions made? Hopefully, at the end of the evening, even though I know everyone here will not agree, that you will at least understand why the decisions were made that were made, what work is included in the project, and what the construction timeframe will look like in terms of schedule and traffic control. So we're going to start with the project planning. This is the projects before they even become a project. So we have several planning tools in the state of New Hampshire. The first is our state red list. This is a list of bridges that are in poor condition. That means one of their elements is rated a 4 on a scale of 0 to 9. It does not mean they're unsafe. It means that they've deteriorated to the point where we know they need some work. Think of this as your house. Your roof starts to wear out. At some point, you know you need to replace your roof. So it's sort of that sort of metric. We expect that they will wear out and that we'll rehabilitate them or replace them as needed. These bridges are inspected every 6 months to ensure their continued safety for the traveling public. We currently have 99 bridges on the New Hampshire Red List as of the end of 2021. This project, as we'll see later, is ranked quite near the top. The second thing we have is the State Bridge Rehab and Replace Priority List. This is formerly called the Bridge Priority Ranking. This also includes non-poor condition bridges that we know will require work. So in this particular instance, this project was started before it got to the red list, because as a trust, we know that that will deteriorate and need more or work more rapidly. As of the end of 2021, there were 200 bridges listed on the New Hampshire R&R priority list. So the next tool that we have is New Hampshire's 10-year Transportation Improvement Plan. This plan is updated every 2 years, and it covers a 10-year time period. The latest version is 2023 to 2032. There are projects from 9 different regional planning commissions throughout New Hampshire that are submitted to the department and prioritized by those planning commissions for inclusion in the plan. One of the things that progressed over time, there was a point in time that this plan was more of a wish list than a true 10-year plan. And something that's happened over approximately the last decade is that we've made great strides to make this fiscally constrained. So this means just like each of you has a household budget, that the projects we plan have to fit within that budget and that anticipated funding that will be coming in the future. There are a series of public hearings held across the state when this is developed, usually somewhere in the order of 20, and it is approved through the New Hampshire State Legislature. One of the other things that gets very complicated in the development of this plan is that the funding comes from multiple sources. The bulk of our capital improvement projects are funded through federal funds. We have a few state sources for specific needs, and each type of funding comes with its own set of restrictions and requirements for use. Even within the federal funding, there are breakdowns based on population and project type that we have to carefully fit the projects to the funding. So getting back to this project, where did it come from? When did it start? So this was first introduced into the 2003-2012 10-year Transportation Improvement Plan. It was scoped at that time as a bridge rehabilitation project, with design funds first allocated in 2011. That's actually when we did obligate the design funds and start that work. Initially, it was added into this bridge priority ranking as number 124. This was back in 2006. It is currently ranked 2 on that list. It was added to the state red list in 2013 when one of the elements became condition rating 4. So again, condition, not safety. And that, again, has a ranking of 2. So as we begin the project development, so little information, a lot of you probably are very familiar with this view. So the roadway, this is a collector roadway. It has an average daily traffic of about 2,100 vehicles per day as of 2021. Back in 2016, it carried about 2,200 cars a day. The approach roadway varies from about 22 feet to 24 feet. The existing bridge was built in 1937. It's a Parker truss. It's actually a 2-span Parker truss. Each span is 230 feet long for a total of 460 feet. It's 21 feet wide between curbs, and it was down posted in 2014 due to the condition of some of the floor system members. So that's important, the floor system members. So when this project was started and introduced into the 10-year plan, we were asked to address the structural deficiencies to allow it to be removed from the red list, restore that load carrying capacity to legal loads, and maintain the river crossing for the next 50 years. That was the goal of the project. It was necessary because of deterioration to the bridge, and the current bridge with the condition of the floor system cannot carry legal loads. It's currently posted for 15 tons. So the question becomes, okay, we have to do something. What is it that we'll do? So this is a high-level look at our project development process. We start in preliminary design with data collection. We develop a range of alternatives. Those alternatives are reviewed at public meetings and with 2 sets of agencies, the cultural resource agencies and natural resource agencies. So that comprises people like New Hampshire DES, Army Corps, the Coast Guard, the State Historic Preservation Officer. Next, we move into the NEPA approval phase. Again, we've done those reviews. Ultimately, there's discussion with Federal Highway, and they give us concurrence on that NEPA document and that selected alternative. And then from there, we move into the final design phase. That's when we do the detailed engineering. We review and do any utility relocation, plans for relocating them. We would acquire private property, should that be necessary for a project, and do all of our environmental permitting in that stage. So preliminary design, as I described, so data collection. The very first thing we do, we find out where is the right-of-way, what utilities do we have in the project area, what different, where is the edge of the stream, do we have endangered species, are there historic resources? Collect all that data. And there were 4 alternatives that were developed to be evaluated. First is the no build. Quite literally, we do nothing. What happens if we do nothing? The next is a rehabilitation. In this case, because there are historic properties, we look at what would a rehabilitation mean that causes no adverse effect to those historic properties. Then we looked at a rehabilitation alternative, and we looked at a replacement alternative. One of the big things that comes into play with all of these projects, anytime there is federal funding or a federal action, so you require a federal permit, that would trigger a NEPA review. This is in compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. So what is NEPA? Because this plays a big role into this project. NEPA is basically an umbrella legislation. It's a procedural legislation that requires you to follow a whole bunch of processes, check in with a whole bunch of other regulations and laws. So a couple that are most relevant on this project are Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 104 of the US DOT Act, Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, and Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. So each of these acts has its own set of requirements that we have to look at and evaluate in the development of these alternatives. I'm not going to go into all of these, but this is the list of all of the different things that had to be determined, evaluated, and considered on this project. What is our wetland impact? Are there threatened and endangered species? How are we affecting farmlands? Are there conservation lands? And one of the things that often gets overlooked when people hear environment, often we think natural environment, but the cultural environment is a piece of that as well. So that's historic structures, archaeological sites. And that's a key component on this particular project. So this site has 5 different cultural resources in and around in close vicinity to the structure. The structure itself was determined to be eligible in 2014. That determination, and that is by the New Hampshire State Historic Preservation Officer, makes that determination. That determination is not made by the department. That determination was later confirmed by the Federal Highway Administration through the Section 106 process in 2017, that they also deemed that this was a historic structure. And then going on, the Lyme Heritage Commission went through the effort of getting the bridge listed on the National Register. So as that goes to National Park Service for their review, that's a 3rd level of confirmation that this bridge is considered historic. Now, it's not the fact that it's historic or that it's on the register that is the key. It's the fact that it's eligible for the register that kicks in some of these regulations. In addition to the bridge, there's the toll house in Lyme on the north side of the road, as well as the Smith and Webster House, opposite side of the river on the north side of the road. Both of those properties were considered to be eligible for the National Register. Additionally, there were 2 archaeological sites. We did some initial work. They did not necessarily rise to that occasion, depending on the level of work that we did. So some of what they look for that comes into play here, so they look at character-defining features. What is it that makes this bridge special? What is it that makes this bridge unique? So several things. The Pratt truss, the shape of the top chords, is a unique element that speaks to this time period. The riveted connections, the diagonals, the steel rail and curb system, all of those things were considered character defining. So when you have resources that are eligible for that list, this triggers the Section 4F of the US DOT Act. This applies to historic resources, recreational resources, and wildlife and waterfowl refuges. So as we go through that process, we have to ask a series of questions. You have to look at those alternatives that we listed and say, does this alternative avoid the use of any of the 4F properties? So that's the first question. You have to ask, does this or does this not use the property? So a use is any sort of impact or change to that property. So if we cannot avoid a use with any alternative, then we can start to consider an alternative that does have a use of one of these properties. So in this case, because we were working on the bridge, one of those alternatives was rehabilitation with no adverse impact. And that would mean that we didn't impact any of those character-defining features that included the bridge rail. So that was an issue on this particular project that we knew to provide safe, modern bridge rail, we would have to replace that, and that in and of itself became an impact. So the answer was, no, we can't avoid impact entirely unless we go with the no build, which we have to look at, but we decided to rule that one out. So next we look at which alternative causes the least harm to those 4F resources. And that's the alternative that we're obligated to select. Which one causes the least harm? So we move into the next phase. We've gathered our data, we've developed some alternatives, and we start looking at comparison between them. Wetlands and surface water, we have to get out in the river, we need wetland impacts, we need river access. So how does that play into each of these alternatives? Floodplains, are we affecting the floodplains? What utilities do we need to displace? Are those utilities in their own easement? And whose cost would it be to move them? Where are the residences? Would any of these impacts require me to take someone's home or a portion of it? What are the impacts to farmland? That's one of those resources that we review under the NEPA policy. The cost does play into it, and in this case, 4F. So when we put all of those alternatives kind of up on the board and started through that alternatives analysis, where that came out as we looked at, well, the no build, we could do that, but that really doesn't solve the purpose of this project. We don't have a way to safely install bridge rail or bring that bridge rail up to standard to not cause a historic impact. So that really narrowed it down to the rehabilitation and the replacement. And that's where the 4F kicked in and said the use of 4F properties is greater with the replacement, and therefore you need to select the rehabilitation alternative. As part of this project, so again, NEPA requires an opportunity for public comment and an opportunity for people to come out and share their opinions. It doesn't necessarily mean that all opinions can be addressed or all suggestions can be incorporated. There were 2 public meetings held for this project. One was in Lyme. We had 30-ish attendees. Hopefully everyone signs the sign-in sheet, because if you were at that first meeting, you weren't counted because you weren't on the sign-in sheet. So I know that's circulating. The second meeting was far more lightly attended, and that was held in Thetford. So that first meeting, we presented some of those environmental resources that we had found. We shared the alternatives that we were looking at. And then as we moved into that second meeting, that's when we shared the alternative that we were moving forward with based on that evaluation. So at this point, we've collected the data, we've looked at these 4 alternatives, we've compared them against their different environmental impacts, and ultimately moved forward with the selection of the rehabilitation under the stipulations of Section 4F. This was confirmed by Federal Highway in their NEPA classification and their 4F finding in January of 2019. So at that point, in 2019 and through the pandemic, our team was working on the final engineering for the project. So that's making the final plans, running the final engineering calculations, working with the utility companies to come up with a relocation plan. There are utilities on the bridge right now that needed to be relocated to allow us to do this work. There are lines that cross the river north and south, although I think the northern lines may have already been moved. And then working with property acquisitions. So we do have one temporary construction easement that was acquired on this project to allow access to the river by the contractor. And then environmental permitting. So we have New Hampshire wetlands permit, a shoreland permit, a Vermont wetlands permit. It has a different name, but there's a flood hazard area river corridor permit, as well as Army Corps of Engineer general permits from both states to allow construction to move forward. All of those were obtained, and we advertised this the first time in September of 2021. This was a very tumultuous time in our bidding. We had several projects that didn't receive bids or only received one bid. I don't know that anyone at the department remembers a time when we had that sort of bidding environment. So we did not receive bids on this particular project. One of the big commentaries was that they needed more time. They just don't have the labor right now to be able to fast track things the way that we may have once been able to do. That's just not where we are as a country and a state right now. So we re-advertised in May, providing them with additional time over the winter to perform this work. And right now we have a total project cost with their bid of approximately $11 million. So that includes the engineering, that little bit of right-of-way acquisition, as well as the construction costs. So talking about what are we doing to the bridge? So here's the bridge. These are some of the various components of the truss bridge. Okay, this does show up. So what you're looking at here, sort of one side of the truss, the verticals, diagonals, the bottom chord. Underneath, there are a series of floor beams that connect the two sides of the trusses together. Those are right here. Every so often. There are 10 of them in each span. And spanning between those floor beams are a series of stringers. So this is that side view of the truss. All of the members in green are staying. They'll be rehabilitated because these are rolled shapes. These are solid sort of H shapes. So there are some spots where there's deterioration. And we are able to fairly readily repair that by plating over it and attaching that to the solid steel. So nothing here, we're not replacing any of these members in the truss. So I forgive the Christmas theme here, but I thought this was the easiest color scheme to get the information across. But again, those green members are all staying. Those can all be repaired or haven't seen the deterioration. What we do see is that those floor beams at the end, this is where the expansion joints are. Expansion joints notoriously end up leaking. So those 4 floor beams will be replaced, as will the exterior stringers. And often that's caused by the salt splashing over. That's one of the surfaces that gets that salt spray. The lateral bracing ties into some of the same connection plates. So even though it doesn't all necessarily need to be replaced, because of the way this is constructed, we're removing it anyway, might as well put new bracing in. So that's why you're seeing those red X's are these pieces here. So they all frame into some of these areas that we're working. So this is a section as if you were driving down the road and sliced the bridge across the road. Your car would travel here. So again, the green, the truss remains. The deck will be replaced. These exterior stringers will be replaced. And then I picked this lovely brown color because red and green make brown to represent the handful of floor beams that will be replaced, those 4, 1 at each end of the 2 spans. So just to summarize, we will be doing some abutment work. We will be doing some repairs to the concrete at the pier. We'll be placing a jacket around the pier at and around the water line. So that's where the worst deterioration is. We'll be cleaning that, adding new rebar, and then forming concrete around that to jacket it or hug it. We'll replace those portions of the framing system that I had shown in red. We'll be replacing the bridge deck by virtue of the fact we have to get to the floor framing. The bridge rail and curb will be replaced with concrete curb and modern crash-tested guardrail. The whole truss will be cleaned and painted. And then there will be some minor approach work, 50 to 100 feet or so, just to make sure everything ties in nicely. So as we get into traffic control, so this is a site plan, and I've colored this up a little bit to hopefully make it more understandable for those in the audience that aren't used to looking at these. So blue is the existing right-of-way. Areas outside of these blue lines are private property. You see we have three, I think there's a garage and a house on this one, but three private properties in the vicinity of the project. As someone pointed out to me, this house is in the right of way. That happens. It's not the first time, or probably the last time, we'll see a historic home within the state's easement. The purple lines here are the existing utility lines across the river. Those utility lines are in their own easement. They hold the property rights to be in that location. If we impact them, that's a project cost to the state and ultimately all of us as taxpayers. The orange here is what we've given the contractor as temporary access. And in this portion, this is where we secured the temporary construction easement. Basically, this is to allow the contractor access to get down to the river so that they can get out to the pier to do that work. Now, this is schematic. We don't have the contractor's final layout for that construction access, but this is where we've provided that room. So as you're looking at this, hopefully this starts to help paint that picture of why a temporary bridge was not included in this project. That there really is not a feasible place to put that temporary bridge without impacting someone's home, without relocating these lines that have the right to be there, that could then in turn impact someone's home, that there's not a place to do that. Additionally, there's a significant cost associated with a temporary bridge. So this project is in keeping with our typical means of addressing traffic control on these Connecticut River crossings. This is a graph of all of the Connecticut, New Hampshire crossing, or Connecticut River crossings, New Hampshire, Vermont crossings. So we have Lebanon, Hartford, the interstate, that's off the chart. And then as you come down, Lyme-Thetford is in here. There are a couple other crossings in that 2,000 plus cars a day range. So overall, this is a relatively low use crossing. And then we pulled, so this is a graph of the rehabilitation projects that we've done over the last 30 years. So roughly 1990 forward. And we colored them to indicate how we maintain traffic. So the orange bridges were detoured. The bridge was closed, traffic went around. The blue bridges, we were able to phase. And usually that's because they're wide enough that you can fit a lane of traffic and do at least half the bridge worth of work. In this case, this bridge doesn't have the width to be able to keep one lane of traffic. That would also be a challenge when you take those floor beams out that span from one side of the road to the other. Don't want cars ending up in the river. And lastly, so there is one temporary bridge on here. This crossing, as you can see, carried, I don't know, just shy of 8,000 cars a day. I think the traffic count is about 7,700 cars a day. And these volumes are in the year of construction, not modern volumes. So in that particular instance, there was an ability to put a bridge in. When it all came said and done, they actually didn't. They worked out some deal with the railroad and used an adjacent railroad bridge to detour traffic. So even though we made the provisions, it wasn't part of that project at the end. So the plan is to close the bridge, get this rehabilitation work done as quickly as we can, and reopen. The detour, so it's about 4 miles between the downtowns. So heading north to Orford Fairleigh is where we anticipate that most residents traveling back and forth between the two states will head, if they're truly traveling from one town to the other. That's about 11.5 miles each way. For people heading south, or for residents of Lyme that are used to hopping over and jumping on 91 to head south into Lebanon or into Hanover, for the duration of construction, you would be routed down Route 10 to those destinations. So we anticipate that most people will head up and around. The next southerly crossing is the Hanover-Norwich Bridge, the Ledyard Bridge. We do have a bridge preservation project going on that project next summer as well, or on that bridge next summer as well. That will be open to traffic during that time. So that bridge right now carries almost 15,000 cars a day, over 15,000 cars a day. So we anticipate between either combining trips, so if you go back and forth across this bridge 6 times every day, maybe you only do it once, that the local traffic between the two towns will head north. We don't anticipate a concern with traffic control on that project for people that are traveling south and over the bridge. One of the other things here, so you'll see a series of little F's all over the place. So those are the fire stations, the best I could get on this map. So Lyme and Thetford sounds like often depend on one another. One thing that I will point out is with the bridge posted at 15 tons, your fire response can't legally travel across that bridge today. An ambulance may be able to, a small volunteer fireman pickup could, but your fire trucks are over that weight limit. So you should be drawing on resources from the other 40 communities in this mutual aid association for fire response today. We do have a whole signed detour package. The plan is not great to look at. We're not meant to read this today. This came out of the PDF, but there's a whole signed package that will be installed to help route people around. So if you've got visitors from out of town, if there are, if you're giving directions, someone would get there and know how to travel around. So then wrapping into the construction schedule. So this is a summation of the construction schedule that has been provided by the contractor to date. They're planning to do quite a bit of the pier work over the winter here, get out, start working on that. And then as soon as the bridge can close per the contract on April 1st, that's when they're going to start getting their detour package up, and they're going to delve right into. So one of the first things that we need to do is address lead paint. So there'll be a whole process out there to remove the lead paint from the bridge, to prime the steel, to get that ready for the rest of the work they'll be doing. So that's this section. The bridge demolition, removing the bridge deck, starting to remove some of those components that are not, that are deteriorated and need to come out. And then they'll slowly be moving through that floor framing, taking pieces out, putting pieces in. So that's basically starting mid-next summer, over the winter, all the way into the following April. They'll be making those repairs and replacing those members. The new deck, so they've got that starting in about the April timeframe. That involves placing concrete, forming the rebar, and that is a summertime type activity. Temperatures need to be warm enough to place concrete without having to tent and heat it. So having the deck placement in the summer is a great place to have it. Some bridge rail, some expansion joints as they're finishing off the bridge approach and the final painting, and then finally reopening at the end of October in 2024. So this is approximately 18 months of bridge work, and looking at the schedule, I now understand why the contractors told me we can't do all of this in one season. It's too big a bridge. A smaller bridge may have been attainable, but at 460 feet, it just wasn't something that could happen. So that concludes my portion of the presentation. I'm hoping that this answered some of the questions. We will open this up. What I'd like to do, because we have such a large crowd, is give people approximately 3 minutes to make a statement or ask a question, because I suspect a lot of you will want to speak. So once we get through an initial round, we can see what time it is and see if there are new questions or comments to be asked. Okay, I have a woman coming back in a maroonish sweater?
Yeah, that's me. Thank you. First, thank you. That was really informative and really clear. I'm Alexis Jetter. I'm on the ad hoc committee that's been raising some concerns about this research. I came 5 minutes late. Sorry about that. So I don't know if you mentioned safety for motorists, pedestrians, and cyclists, but that seems strikingly missing from the data, the analysis, the questions that were guiding this plan. This idea that the Ledger Bridge could handle the additional motorists coming across it. I don't know about you, but I try to cross that bridge every morning between 7:30 and 8:30, and it is jammed all the way back to the highway, and it takes a good half hour just to get over the bridge. The idea that those two bridges are going to be under construction or closed simultaneously, and I think I quote you, we don't anticipate a problem. I anticipate a huge problem, and you may have heard a gasp from anyone here in the room about the Ledger Bridge being partly closed during the same time. That would be an enormous factor.
So again, I guess to clarify, it's not closed. That will be open to traffic during construction.
No, I understand that, but I'm talking about what it's like to try to get across that bridge, which is a narrow bridge, now is a headache, and people have actually changed their work schedules, okay? To the extent that they can, get across that bridge and not be late for work. Nikki Corral, I hope, speaks tonight based on what she talked about, almost running over a pedestrian with a baby carriage on that bridge a few years ago, and not being able to see that before she was right upon them. The possibilities for tragedy are enormous, and we have to change the design of the bridge. Finally, my own experiences walking across that bridge are terrifying. Some motorists are very conscientious, some truck drivers are very conscientious. The only way to protect people is for motorists to stop, wait for there to be no one coming in the opposite lane, and then move over to the lane and come over. People do that because we have a community that cares about each other, but a lot of people don't. I have plastered myself against the outside of the bridge and just prayed when trucks come by. They almost seem to take pleasure, and you're left with that rumble and that terror. That has to change. Finally, this idea that historic houses are within the right-of-way. Understandable, right? These houses were built long before there were right-of-ways. But I don't think we should dismiss that, particularly if we're talking about a temporary bridge. If there's a historic house on the north side of the bridge, on the Lyme side of the bridge, and my understanding is there's more than one, and the only reason we're not having a temporary bridge, which will come and go, is because we cannot use that public right-of-way temporarily. I don't know how to answer that sentence. That's what right-of-ways are for. So again, thank you for your presentation. You were very clear about all the environmental stuff. Usually it's like people seem to matter more than the environment. We're in this very strange state now where, what about us? And that's my question. Thank you.
So I may not address these in order, but I think to your last point about the right-of-way, so if you look at the width of the road here, what I'm hearing is that this is narrow and this is a problem. So if you look at the width of this road and the distance from the road to the edge of the right-of-way, there's physically not room to construct a temporary bridge. Whether that house was there or not, that we don't have the space with which to install that. And so that's what led to the decision here. It wasn't necessarily the homes, that factors into it, but that when you start to have to put something at least this wide, if not wider, in a space that's not that big, that's a challenge. From the bike and ped side, so this one has come up several times in the project history. We did review whether or not it was possible to cantilever something off the outside. So this is similar to what was part of the original design on Orford Fairley. Some of them we've been able to add them. I know Orford Fairley came up as an example. That was original to the 1930s structure. So when we looked at adding that sidewalk, what we found was that the bridge members at that point can't take that additional load on top of legal traffic loads. This goes back to that cost. Is the purpose, what was that purpose? The purpose where we started this project was to address the condition of the bridge. It wasn't to expand and make a bicycle and pedestrian connection between the two towns. The roads don't have shoulders or sidewalks right now. So if we were to build that on the bridge, where do they go once we get off the bridge? So it does factor in, but we also have to make the best use of that funding that's available to us and the best use of the resources we have. So ultimately, this is all taxpayer money. And we're trying to do things as efficiently as possible, as fiscally responsible as possible. Our estimate on a temporary bridge is somewhere in the neighborhood of approximately $5 million. That's a huge cost for 2,200 cars a day. On top of the physical limitations of where do we put the bridge. So that is a piece, and then there is the environmental piece with the historic aspect, that this bridge has life in it, it's valuable from a historic sense, and that's what we're trying to preserve. I think there was a gentleman in the middle here with a plaid shirt.
You laid out a schedule ending in October 2024. How often, if ever, do these projects stay on time? And what's the track record of this low bidder for staying on record? Are we going to be looking at 2025, 2026? I mean, we're going to all of a sudden say, oh, we couldn't get it done, because I mean, that seems like we're right up against winter of the following winter there. So.
We don't have statistics necessarily on how, or I don't have statistics necessarily on how often any particular contractor goes beyond schedule. It does happen on occasion, but I do not foresee that this would extend into the next winter. I mean, I don't know, Jeff, do you have anything to add there?
I don't have anything to add to that, and it's in the sense that a lot of the projects do come in on time, and in this particular case, the completion deadline is casting gold in the sense that, they start incurring liquidated.
Typically, one of our goals is to carry legal loads, but that is something we could go back and see, would it be possible?
My guess is if you talk to the people here and they wanted to know whether a cement truck could safely pass over it, or
No.
they would rather have, no, I mean when you're completed, would they be willing to pay a little extra for a concrete delivery and have pedestrian access? I don't think there'd be much doubt as to what the outcome of that vote might be. So I just would like to suggest that perhaps the engineers consider what the ultimate rating might be. And, for example, if you can get all the safety vehicles, the fire trucks and so on, and yet skip the concrete trucks when you're finally done and have a pedestrian thing as well, you're saying that's not possible.
No, by the time, like the fire trucks are some of the heavier vehicles that we see. I don't have exact figures. It looks like there may be a few people here that do have them. But by the time you can safely carry a fire truck, you're carrying the concrete trucks, you're carrying the oil delivery trucks, you're carrying the town dump truck back and forth.
Well, that's excuse me, that's not actually true, because a safety truck is automatically, especially if you were to establish lights at each end, they could radio, activate those lights, and stop any other traffic. So the bridge would only have to carry that weight of that one vehicle.
That could be
So
evaluated.
I really think that if you take a broad look at the thing, I think it could be possible. I just wish that, given the way people seem to think about it, that might have some value. Thank you.
Hampton. That is the Vascule Bridge that carries 1A over Hampton Harbor. That's my project too. Did you have anything on this project? Okay. How about in the back with the black jacket? Yeah, that's you.
There was a bridge in North-Thetford built and washed away some years ago. The pier still stands in the middle of the river and the right-of-way must still exist. Was that considered for a temporary bridge?
It was not. So a lot of New Hampshire's right-of-way is actually easement right-of-way. We own very little of our right-of-way in fee, which means when these roads were laid out, we were given a certain width that we could use for transportation purposes. Once that ends, that typically would go back to those property owners. So it's unlikely that we own that.
We don't. It went through the governor's council to give up the right-of-way.
Okay. So we don't own that right-of-way. We have looked at it since. I know that question has come up. So from a traffic standpoint, we have a rail crossing very, very close to the roadway on the Vermont side. Both roadways are municipal roadways. So the state typically will put our detours on state roadways. We don't want to put additional wear and tear necessarily on a municipal roadway. So that complicates things. Because the next piece, looking at this whole evaluation and this environmental process, very likely those stone abutments are historic. So that comes with its whole own host of mitigating, avoiding, that sort of thing. And that's the big if. They can even carry traffic. So from our understanding, they've been abandoned for approximately 50 years. So for an engineer to look at those abutments and feel comfortable putting the traveling public on stone abutments, unknown foundations, unknown stability, we would be looking at whole new temporary structures in the river. A temporary bridge of this magnitude, we're looking at somewhere between 550 to 600 feet, depending on where the location is. For a temporary bridge, that's looking at 4 to 5 spans, most likely, to span that. So we would be looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of, I don't know, at approximately 3 or more locations where we need to put temporary supports in the river. This section of the river is quite deep. After they built the dam downstream, some of the initial pictures, it's amazing. The whole pier is exposed, built the dam, and the water level came up. So there are quite a few challenges associated with that temporary bridge and that North-Thetford crossing between the right-of-way, the railroad lines, and the ability of those abutments to carry load isn't really a feasible location to do that. We'll go with the woman in the green jacket.
Yes, I wanted to comment on the bicycle and pedestrian crossing, and while this may not be a ideal solution, I've wondered about having a traffic light or something at the access points that could be somehow controlled, perhaps by a pedestrian or some other means, so that pedestrians and bicyclists would cross, and that would incur any additional cost of a pedestrian bridge. I know that in covered bridges, we can typically stop and allow traffic one at a time to go through, and that doesn't seem to be a problem. There's more traffic going over this bridge, but still, maybe that's a solution that would allow pedestrians to safely and bicyclists to safely cross.
Thank you for that comment. That is something that we've talked a little bit about the Regional Planning Commission. So that 10-year plan process that I talked about, bringing these concerns to our regional planning commissions so they can evaluate them, they can get them into that plan to continue to be evaluated. That is something. We could do a planning study or a feasibility study to see, is there a traffic light scenario that could work? Is that all the time? Is it on demand? It's something that we could certainly evaluate in the future. Oh boy. I don't know. We're gonna go to this side of the room. The woman in purple, or black? I don't know. It looks purple. I think it's black. Yes.
I'm really disappointed that in the vast bureaucratic approach to what bridge we would get, that it was all environmental and historical and wetlands and that, and the needs of the communities were never addressed. The needs of a modern bridge were never addressed. It was this old relic that was fine when vehicles were not as big as they are now. And we need to look at the future, and we need bicycle and pedestrian access as we try and stop climate change and try and change our transportation away from vehicles and things. We need pedestrian, we need bicycles. And please, you know, you seem to be telling us the door is shut. It's all decided. You can't go back on this. But is there any way that we can put a halt on this and reevaluate this? Because really, you're giving us a bridge that's an antique from the past. We need a bridge that for the present and the future. So please try and do that.
So before we go on, I guess I want to, when I opened the presentation, one of the things that I explained, we are in construction. We have a contract with the contractor.
No,
Yes.
I just think that's a wrong attitude.
Well,
Sorry.
so it would be unprecedented to cancel that contract. We have spent millions of dollars that would need to be paid back to Federal Highway. So let's entertain. So the what if, right? What happens if we don't do this project? So besides the millions of dollars, where does that go? That goes to the end of the 10-year plan, because the next 10 years are full of projects. So best case would be construction in 2033. This bridge will not be open till 2033 if we don't do this project. So there is a very good risk that this bridge could be closed for years before we find the funding to be able to do something different. So the reality of the situation is we have a contract, it's been awarded, we have never backed out of a contract for no cause. So this would be unprecedented, involve the Attorney General, probably years of litigation, and an almost guarantee that this bridge would be closed for far longer than the construction project before we got around to designing and funding a different project to the tune of at least double, if not closer to triple by the time it comes due, the cost of this rehabilitation. So I know, like I said at the beginning, this isn't necessarily the answer some people are going to want to hear, but we have to make difficult decisions with the transportation funding we have to maintain the infrastructure we have the best that we can. And for this crossing, that resulted in the rehabilitation. So, woman in the back with the, yeah, yep.
I just have a question. Is there any economic compensation for businesses that will be adversely affected by, because most are small businesses, individually owned by local people, and I just think it can really impact their economic viability. And we depend on these small businesses for groceries, for, you know, our dentists, our physicians, our haircutters, everything. So
there is not an ability to compensate businesses directly. One of the things that I've been speaking with a few of the town officials about is the possibility of adding some business signage to help get the word out. Now, that's not something that Federal Highway can fund, but if there were other sources to fund that, we could work with the towns to get them up and make sure it's known that they're open, help provide some wayfinding signs. Gentlemen in the group.
I farm but we own farms on both sides of the river. And I can't begin to tell you how dangerous this bridge is. And you know how upsetting it is coming here and hear you just tell us now? It doesn't matter what you say today, because we awarded the contract, we didn't listen to you, and we didn't give any considerations. Because what you just told us is it doesn't matter what you say, what people's opinions are, because we're going to build this bridge, we've awarded contracts, and we don't care what you say. And we don't care about safety. Because what you ought to call this bridge is death trap. That's what this bridge is, it's a death trap. And you didn't listen. Well, I went to the meeting, whenever it was, 5, 6 years ago. I didn't realize it was that long. And they wouldn't listen to us then. I was frustrated then. And now I thought, well, good, we got a chance to voice our concerns, and you just told us, we're not listening to you. We've awarded this contract. We don't care about safety. We don't care about your concerns or considerations. And I'm just here to appease you, because I'm going to go back to the department, and we're not doing anything different tomorrow. That's what you just said to us. And I tell you, it's very upsetting, because we have to live with this the rest of our lives. And somebody's going to get hurt, because everybody keeps saying the same thing. It's about safety. What about pedestrians? I go through there with farm equipment and trucks, and it's almost impassable. And I get cars coming at me 50 miles an hour. There's nothing I can do. And you get this narrow little bridge, and you're not listening. And you're not, I got really upset when I just heard what you said, because you're not doing anything different. And what you should do, you should go back to the department tomorrow and say, you know what? We got this wrong. That's what you should, if you're going to do your job, you're going to go back and say, we got this wrong. Before I got involved, after I was involved, we got it wrong. We need to relook at what we're doing here. But instead, you're going to go home tomorrow and you're just going to go on your business tomorrow, and nothing's going to change on this bridge. That's what you ought to just be telling us. Thank you.
I think it's a fact, there are laws, there are regulations, they have all been carefully followed. And I think the basic mistake was designating this bridge an historic landmark. If that had not happened, you would be in a completely different position, and that's not your position. That was the local position to start. So now you pay the price for historic. And that's fact. That's not law, that's fact.
Hi, I live in Lyme, and you can tell from this group that the community is really one community. I'm sure you're getting that sense. Our friends and shops and schools are as likely to be on the other side as this side. But with regard to the historic aspect, which this lady thinks makes it absolutely no way, I don't believe that's the case. If you have something which is causes an adverse impact, which of course taking the bridge down would be an adverse impact, it doesn't mean that you can't do it. It clicks on a different process, and that process requires consultation, as in meetings like this and others. So I don't think people should think that it's a no way Jose if it's a historic resource. It's still possible with an adverse impact to have an adverse impact. I wish I'd been there however many years it was ago. I don't know how well those meetings were advertised. I wonder if the 18-month closure was anticipated or mentioned at that time. My guess is probably not, and that's a whole other issue.
It was 2 years, but not a full 18 months.
I just, I like someone else, wish we could have a pause and find a way to build a bridge that meets the pedestrian and bicycle needs and all the needs of the community without spending all of our money on a bridge that doesn't. And I heard you mention the 10-year state plan, but that is a plan with state policies. The plan can be changed if the design for a new bridge was available in 2 years, let's say. One could adjust the plan. It is a fact of the legislature making decisions. I would hope that our representatives working with you guys can come up with a way to, a innovative financial way to make this happen, to meet everybody's needs. Thank you.
I'm going to have John respond to the historic piece. John is our Chief Environmental Manager.
So I guess if I'm understanding your question or comment correctly, essentially, as Jennifer mentioned previously, the Section 4F requires us to either first avoid the use of a Section 4F resource, in this case it's a historic resource, And then if we can't avoid it, then we have to choose the alternative that results in the least overall harm. That takes into account a lot of different things, and some of those things are, fiscal, constraints, and as well as safety concerns and those kinds of things. And all of those go into that assessment. And that assessment was then, we did conduct that assessment back in 2017. And that assessment resulted in a determination from the Federal Highway Administration that we have chosen the alternative that results in the least overall harm to not only a historic resource, but also taking into account all the other environmental and socioeconomic impacts. And that's what happened in this case here. And so that determination is a very formal and a process that comes directly from the Federal Highway Administration, and they made that decision, and that was that's how this alternative was chosen.
I understand that it's the least harmful alternative, but I also know that there are examples where we can actually, if a bridge really needs to be, or other historic resource for that matter, is really deteriorated to such a point that it doesn't make sense to replace it. It is acknowledged as an adverse impact, and you have to go through a process, and you can still move forward.
So this project does have an adverse impact. It's not just about the fact that we don't have that we're avoiding an adverse impact. We have an adverse impact just due to the rail system itself. It's the fact that there is an alternative that is feasible and prudent that can minimize harm to that historic resource. And that's where the decision was, what came from.
So 50 years from now, we'll have to do the same thing again, right? I mean, we can't ever build a new bridge. 500 years from now, we still have to have that bridge, right?
Again, I mean, laws change and that kind of stuff, but and ultimately, you go through this process every time you do any project. So essentially, yes, but that bridge, say we replace this with a new bridge, after a certain point, even that new bridge could become a historic resource, and it would undergo that same level of scrutiny.
I think the other thing that I would like to address before I take the next question is that design timeframe. So our replacement projects take roughly 6 to 7 years from the time the funding is available to start the design. So that's not going to be tomorrow if we went down that path of what does something different look like. It's going to take time to program that, and it's going to take time to find the funds to fund something different. So again, time frame wise, we're talking a huge delay and very likely a prolonged closure.
So if you were making these determinations in 2017, why didn't you go back out to the community and have a conversation with them? I mean, having these conversations in 2001 in each community, 2014 and 2015, and then nothing since then. It just doesn't make any sense to me at all. I mean, there's part of me that's saying, boy, I hope New Hampshire DOT is learning something from this and that they don't repeat this kind of process, because this is ridiculous. I mean, look at the number of people here. We all want to be able to, I think everybody wants to try and come up with a solution, but I would agree with I don't know the man's name, but the farmer who said, it just feels like it doesn't matter what we say. And I'm curious to know as to whether or not when those meetings took place in 2014 and 2015, was it just, this is what we're doing, what do you think? Or was it, tell us what your concerns are? I suspect it was the former. And when you do that kind of engagement work with people, all you get is pushback, because everybody thinks it's a done deal.
The early meetings, so I can't speak to what exactly transpired, but I understand, I had a lot of calls and emails. I understand that there's frustration. This project, for whatever reason, did take longer than typical from those public meetings to get to construction. Again, I don't have all of the history or know all of those reasons why. on a project like this, 2 meetings is fairly typical. The first meeting is usually what we sort of call a blank sheet meeting. It's usually early on the project. We've identified some of these environmental resources. We have some ideas, and that's probably the one that's the most important to come and have people give their thoughts, give their opinions. And again, that's in the framework of what is this project trying to achieve? The second meeting is typically more of okay, we've taken that feedback, we've looked at all of these things, here's what we're looking at. Sometimes we have an alternative, sometimes we've narrowed it down to 1 or 2. So I acknowledge that there was probably a lengthier delay than there should have been, but those public meetings are typically in that preliminary time frame, and there's generally a few years between when that decision is made and when the project advertises. So I think I've got...
Maggie Butts, Regional Planning Commission. I will add, though, that just because there wasn't a public hearing, DOT, the Regional Planning Commission, and other elected folks or representatives of the towns have been meeting on this project often throughout the years. And there's been notices sent to select boards and things like that. If it doesn't get to you, I apologize, but I will say there has been some communication, maybe not the best public communication since 2017, but there is. It's not like we completely ignored everybody until today.
You've had your hand up for a while.
Thank you. Tara Pact, I was at the first 2 meetings, and there were a lot of questions asked in 2014. Far fewer in 2015 because it was poorly attended. I feel that they were also very well advertised, and I wasn't on the listserv at that point. I don't even know if it existed in 2014, but I'm also 2 houses away from the bridge. And a concern that I have that I want to reiterate is that there isn't sidewalks on either side in Lyme or in Thetford. It does, once you get off the bridge, you're also putting yourself at risk. And the thought of a stoplight on that curve coming down in the winter from Lyme into Thetford is a concern for me. I would be concerned about that. I also want to thank you for taking your time to be here, knowing that you were not necessarily coming into a warm and friendly place. I think we're all friendly and warm, but I think emotions are high, so I just want to make sure that somebody says thank you. So
I appreciate it. Okay, you're jumping around. Okay.
Yeah, I'm Karen Henry, and I live in Lyme. And while you're here, why don't you, if you could briefly comment on it occurs to me that there would be a lot of environmental disruption involved with constructing a new bridge. And while you're here, could you make some comments on that? Compare the 2 alternatives in terms of environmental impacts on the river?
Sure. I mean, a lot of the environmental assessment came down to the original assessment that a rehabilitation option was a viable solution. So then it's a matter of, okay, looking at that and looking at the environmental impacts associated with that. So we don't go into depth with some of the environmental impacts associated with, say a replacement option, because we had already determined that a rehabilitation option was very much on the table, and was essentially the preferred alternative, or the anticipated alternative. That having been said, if you're replacing the bridge with larger, with a larger structure, those kinds of things, it does result in increased, environmental impacts, to the point. If we were to replace, we likely would have to replace with a larger structure to meet some of the DES requirements for the size, the length requirements, which then, in this case here, this is a long bridge. Jennifer's the bridge engineer. I'm not an engineer, but one thing I can tell you with moderate certainty is that a single pier, or how many piers do we have? 1, 2, just one. It's unlikely you'd be able to construct that longer structure with a single pier in the middle. You likely would be into several piers, increased impacts to the banks and those kinds of things, a rehabilitation option is always going to be the least environmentally, from a natural resource standpoint, it's always going to be the least environmentally impactful alternative, just simply because it doesn't touch it as much, and, you know, the surrounding area as much as a project where you would be replacing the bridge itself. Right, the footprint would get larger, the abutments would need to be larger, all those kinds of things, and in order to maintain traffic, you'd be talking about off a line, which means you're just disrupting more of those banks, more of the stream channel itself, and the list goes on.
One of the other things on the replacement that I think I may have written to, I don't know, one or many of you here, a truss bridge like this carries most of its load in that truss sort of above the roadway surface. So when we go to a more conventional girder bridge carried by beams below the roadway surface and start talking about spans like this, we're looking at a roadway increase in the neighborhood of 6 feet or more. So that's 6 feet adjacent to these homes, that's 6 feet that needs to tie into these intersections, 6 feet high. And then we want a wider structure. So that footprint expands significantly. So I think that's something that can easily be overlooked from the engineering standpoint, but this is a navigable water of the US. This requires a US Coast Guard permit. Because we have the bridge rehabilitation, this project didn't require a permit, but looking at a replacement, we would have to evaluate and likely maintain at least the clearance that's there now over the water. So that is a potential impact of a replacement as well that was part of the original analysis. Gentleman here in the plaid.
Was the lack of safety for pedestrians and cyclists considered when prioritizing what bridge should be replaced or refurbished condition?
It is not, so again, this dates back over 20 years. So what we've seen in the last probably 2 to 3 10-year plan cycles is that there's been a significant increase in the desire for multimodal facilities. And sometimes it is a little hard to catch up, but then again, we look back at the traffic volumes, the approach roadway facilities, so it wasn't necessarily part of that purpose. As we look at our bridge rehabilitation program, that piece isn't necessarily part of it. Now, taking a more holistic approach, would it have been? Again, not necessarily. It's sort of weighing all of the different needs around the state to say, is this a place where we can accommodate this? Where are we building these facilities to? It's one thing to put it on the bridge, but if it has no place to go on the roadway, are we also building 2 miles of shoulders and sidewalk to each town center? That's 4 miles of construction to accommodate that. So where do those go? If there was a school on one side and a whole neighborhood on the other, would that have been different? I don't know. So no, initially getting into our programs, we're generally looking at maintaining our infrastructure, trying to keep it in good condition and safe condition. I know there's been some discussion of safety. I did have our traffic engineers look into our crash data. So we have 0 records of crashes on this bridge in the last 12 years in New Hampshire and over the last 5 years in Vermont. So the 2 closest crashes in New Hampshire were at the intersection. One person went off the curb heading towards the bridge in icy conditions. The other one involved an animal. I'm gonna guess a deer, but you never know. So likewise in Vermont, there are some at the intersection and on the other roads, but there's not an accident history that's been demonstrated. So I'm hearing the concern. Gentlemen, and yeah.
Well, given that the project has been awarded and the construction has been designed, are there operational changes that you can make to the way the bridge functions as designed other point I would say is operationally on the contract, many contracts include acceleration clauses. Is that still a possibility to negotiate to reduce this 18 months if the vendor can outperform or run overtime or work nights? And maybe he doesn't have the labor right now, but if there's a golden ticket that's cheaper than, you know, some type of incentive for him to accelerate the project. We talked about delaying the project and that there's negative aspects, but is that still a possibility to negotiate that with the contractor or put it out?
I don't know that we have precedent for doing that. That's something that I can bring back and have discussions on. In terms of the operational changes, I very much think there's an opportunity to work with regional planning and to develop a project to evaluate what could be done, whether that's signals or...
I live on East Thetford Road, and every morning the traffic is coming from Vermont into Route 10, and every evening it's going the other way. So it may not be a big impact to just make it a one-way bridge with some signage well up the hill coming down from Lyme, and some type of a light pattern that people have to wait a little bit, and then you get a route on the other side where it's just a one-lane bridge.
Okay, I'm trying to find people that haven't spoken yet.
I second this lady. As it seems to be that things are kind of set in stone, that the only thing we could do is have it a one-way bridge with some kind of electric, I guess, signage at each end, have a pedestrian lane, and a one-way for farm equipment, and so on. That seems to be kind of a compromise, as this bridge design seems to be, as I said, set in stone.
Gentleman in the teal, yeah. Yep.
John Mudge, I live over in Lyme. My family moved here 60 years ago, and I can't even begin to guess how many times I've crossed that bridge to either go to Huggett's or Wings or the post office or up to 91. Those of you who are here who remember George Huggett, I would love, it's too bad he can't be here because I'd love to hear his comments about this. I'm discouraged that you had meetings in 2014 and 2015 and then sort of went back to Concord, did your thing, and you're now coming up here and said, we're going to close the bridge for 18 months. I don't think this community on either side of the river was given the adequate information about that. And a question that I'd like to ask is, familiar with the bridge between Bradford and Piermont, that has a pedestrian pathway on it. You made the comment that the bridge in Orford, that was designed onto that. The bridge in Piermont, was that designed onto it or added on?
From what I understand, that was added on in a project.
And yet you refused to consider that here between Thetford and Lyme.
That's incorrect. We did consider it.
And you've thrown it in the trash.
Because the bridge can't support the loading. So one of the common misconceptions on pedestrian loading is that it's just a person. How much can one person weigh? So as engineers, we can't design for the one person. That pedestrian loading, as you look at a wider bridge, rivals that of vehicular loading. Because we have to assume that you're gonna start having dragon boat races or rubber ducky races down the Connecticut. We have to assume that there are going to be pedestrians along that whole sidewalk. So the codes that we design to, that loading can be quite high. And as we look at the truss, can it accommodate that? In this case, it couldn't. I wasn't an engineer working on these projects in the early 90s. I wasn't an engineer at all in the early 90s. So how that analysis was done, how that particular bridge was designed, it was determined that that could be the case. For this structure, it was not feasible. Was that, I know we heard from you, was there somebody behind you that had a, okay, nope. Okay.
I think some of the criticism has been on the harsh side, frankly. I think that you actually appear to be open-minded and thinking about ways that we may be able to accommodate pedestrians and bicycle riders and such across this bridge. I appreciate that, and I do hope you go back to your office and work with the regional planners to come up with a solution for the long term. I know the temporary bridge is gonna be a pain in the butt for, you know, a year and a half. But when we're talking about pedestrians and such, we're talking about decades worth. So I do appreciate that. I see you nodding your head and taking notes. So, like I said, I think some of the criticism has been overly harsh. So thanks for your
Okay, there's a gentleman in the very back in a tan coat.
Hi, Steve Topol, I'm on the Thetford Select Board. I just wanted to thank you for coming up here and walking into the Lions Den tonight. I don't think anyone invited Daniel, but I appreciate your coming very much.
Thank you. There's a woman with a mask. Yep. You don't have to take it off. But yeah.
You want to hear me? Joanne Burns from Thetford Center. I really appreciate what this fellow said about the idea of alternating, maybe with lights at both ends. It's not something I had thought about before. Maybe what's needed, that happened with the covered bridge on Tucker Hill Road. We needed to put up stop signs so the cars could alternate more safely. I was actually crossing that bridge twice on Saturday and had to flatten myself in that extremely fearful position that many of you know here to not be hit by cars and trucks along the way. And it is truly, truly frightening. So the possibility of either way, but pedestrians will not be able to cross fast enough, even with the alternating light idea. I've bicycled out west, and sometimes for some of the long tunnels there, they have a place where you can push a button and a sign starts flashing, bicyclist in tunnel. And we can have maybe pedestrian on bridge or something like that, because otherwise it's still not tenable for pedestrians. Switching gears a little bit, you know, clearly you understand our concerns, the primary concerns about the length of time that the 24-mile round trip detour or the 34-mile round trip detour will be. The length of time the bridge will be out of service, the overlap with possible construction of the Ledger Bridge down by Hanover and Norwich, and then the the safety concerns in general. You, of course, have a much better grasp on all of this than any of us possibly can. If you were part of our community and sharing these concerns, what possibilities do you see for places where there could be another way to look at this or something done differently with the process so we don't just go forward as if nobody cares and nobody's listening?
So I think there are a few things that, going back to Concord, I'd like to follow up with my team on. So there's been, and it really comes down to some of these suggestions and comments about the traffic. So I think discussing with regional planning and our staff, is there a possibility, what do we do about getting a project so that we have engineering to maybe look at some of this? Doing some of those traffic studies, what does this mean? Correspondence potentially with the towns, if the towns reach out as well, meaning the select boards, how viable is maintaining a lower load posting? Does that actually help with the pedestrian issue? I don't know. So we need to look at some of those answers. But I think the biggest thing is to continue to work with the regional planning commissions. If there is this strong need for a connection, some other connection between the two states, to work with them to get that programmed so that's something that we can continue to look at moving forward. It may or may not be able to happen as part of this project, but the sooner that gets planned and the sooner we can program that, the sooner we could potentially come up with that solution. So I would encourage you to really work with those planning agencies. Gentleman, right here.
Just a comment, when you have future public hearings, please schedule
amplification so we can hear.
I know we, I see you, but I want to make sure we get to anybody new. I think, have you spoken?
I have not.
Okay.
So, I'm responsible for the design and being closed out from Lyme, we anticipate that we're going to lose approximately $1 million worth of revenue from our Lyme customers. So I guess I'm asking, what is the likelihood, what is the possibility that Jack's suggestion would be brought back to Concord, that there could be some incentives for the bidding company to speed up the timeframe? Is that unprecedented? Does that ever happen in these contracts?
It is unprecedented at this point to go back. It doesn't mean I can't ask the question.
I know that my business is only open 6 months out of the year. If we're going to lose $1 million, and we're just a small little farm stand, the businesses on both sides stand to lose probably tens of millions of dollars.
Okay, anybody else that
You've got online questions here.
Oh, that's right. Sorry. You need to jump.
Hey!
Okay.
So, Mary Helen Bentley asks, I'm wondering if there can be a boat launch area created so that we can ferry back and forth between Vermont and New Hampshire.
Yeah, $50 a head.
I know. Sarah Crockett asks, if we can't change the current plan for the bridge, what would it take to consider adding a smaller bridge that could support a single vehicle or like a stoplight at either end? Going through, Keith Borgstrom asks, why was the contract awarded without first seeking out input from the residents?
Can you repeat the question? I didn't hear it.
Why was the contract awarded without first seeking out input from the residents? Liz Cole asks, did you say the design began in 2011?
Yes, the funding was first obligated for the design in 2011. I believe the contract, or the consultant, was issued notice to proceed either late 2012 or early 2013. So we'll often do survey and some of that initial work right off the bat, and then once we have that information, our design consultant will start work.
Leslie Gannon asks, will there be a link to these slides in a future time?
Yes, we can put them up on the department's website. There's a project website on the department page, and we can post this.
Trying to go through any that are redundant. Matt Hayden asks, why move to achieve a goal without thoughtful alignment of that goal setting with stakeholders? Probably also answered pretty.
Part of that 10-year plan, again, that's an opportunity for everyone to come and have a say in what projects move forward, how do we program those projects. So again, if you're interested in transportation, interested in bike ped, look out for those meetings, keep that on your radar as a time to provide that input directly to the Governor's Advisory Council on Transportation.
I should have two more, is that okay?
Yeah.
Lenore Bolton asks, had you considered the bridge in a backpack method used by Woodstock, Vermont? The bridge was replaced in exceptionally short time.
No. I am familiar with the bridge in a backpack, so for this type of crossing, that would not be a viable bridge type due to the geometry of the site. And one more?
Let's see if I can get one more. DC Dennison asks, what about adding a foot bike bridge where the old North-Thetford Bridge was? Do New Hampshire and Vermont still own that right-of-way?
No, we don't own the right-of-way. Talk to the Regional Planning Commission.
Okay, you're good. Yeah.
Jesse Pact, East Thetford. I live, 2 houses away from the bridge itself. I wake up every morning and look at it. My question goes back to funding and being realistic about the funding, where the funding comes from. And I wrote this down a while ago. do we lose certain funding if we don't follow the prescribed selection process that is in place right now? At the state level, at the federal level, and that going back to that slide of where all the funding for a project like this comes from, as you've said, in that 10-year plan, this funding is very carefully laid out. And if we ditch that plan and we go try and do something else that is not what we've already decided to and fulfill that contract, like realistically, besides the closing the bridge in a few years because we can't use it at all, and like you said, we're talking like 2 to 3 times the cost if we wait on another design. And what are we sacrificing in funding? What do we lose from that whole funding picture that you were talking about if we wait?
So we've spent approximately $1.3 million in engineering and right-of-way. If we don't move forward with a project, we have to pay that back to Federal Highway Administration. Like I said, it's unprecedented to cancel a contract once it's in construction. So what that financial piece, what that outlay of state funds is to pay the contractor and Federal Highway to settle something like that, we just don't know. The other piece of that ties in is having to basically give back that federal funding. Not all of our federal funding can go back into a pool to be used again. There's a portion of this, so there were, I believe, 3 different rounds of special funding on top of what we typically receive each year, specifically directed at poor condition bridges. So this project used a portion of that funding, and that funding has a set expiration date. So that funding goes away. We're not able to reuse that. So conservatively, on the low side, we're talking probably just between engineering and the funding that lapses, $3 to $4 million. What we end up settling with the contractor, probably quite a bit more than that. I feel like there was more to that question. Is there another piece that I'm missing here?
It's just the reality that if we find some loophole and force the states to delay this construction for some reason, that the bridge will be closed. It will be closed, and for a far longer time. And that there is no provision for a temporary bridge there. We've already stated why. And so the upshot is not only will it cost more, but the crossing will be closed for far longer. And we're probably talking 12 to 15 years before we see a replacement bridge that fits our current sensibility.
And in today's dollars, so again, this current project cost is around $11 million. So our estimate today, just for the construction of a replacement, is around $20 million. Add to that design costs, right-of-way acquisition costs, inflation over 10 or more years. It's a significant amount of money for that sort of thing. All right, anybody else that hasn't spoken yet?
I got one quick one. My name is Greg Hammond. I live in Lyme on River Road, very close to the bridge. And I cross that bridge virtually every time I go out to go anywhere. And I just wanted to comment from a cycling standpoint. I ride my bike over that bridge, I'm going to guess 10 times a week, 52 weeks a year. And I'm sort of surprised how dangerous everybody thinks it is from a cycling standpoint. I mean, it would be great if all the roads were wide, but cycling on the road is dangerous. And that doesn't strike me as the most dangerous place, even remotely within a half mile there. It's flat, it's straight. When I cross it, the cars typically will wait till I'm to the other side before they pass me. I don't think I've ever had 2 cars pass at the same time adjacent to me there. That said, the wider the better, but it's not a perfect world. Do we have any data on how many bikes cross that a day or how many pedestrians? And if you do build a bridge like that nowadays with a traffic load of 2,200 cars a day, do you typically provide a pedestrian or bike lane for that resource?
We typically would put 5-foot shoulders for the cyclists. Pedestrian-wise, we'd have to do some counts. I don't have counts. Adding a sidewalk when there is no pedestrian facility on the approach roadways is not something we would typically do, because that has to end. Where does it go when you get off the bridge? So likely it would be in the form of a wider shoulder than what's out there today.
Right. And like I said, the safer the better. but the reality is every area can't be safe. And a flat, straight road with good sight distance like that, when I ride my bike around that area, I don't feel dangerous at all there, whereas I do many places very close by to it.
Okay, I think we're down to you're new.
I think you still have to go back to the historic significance and who put that in place. Because no matter what happens in the next 10 years, or the next however many years, you still have that hanging over your head. And how long the people were who put it up for historic relevance, but they should have had a little more thought.
So it's not about it being on the register of historic places, it's about it being eligible. But the eligibility is to make those determinations. It's a process essentially, and they do inventories of the bridge and all that kind of stuff, and they that determination was made that it is historic, and the fact that it now is on the register.
In 2020, it's designated.
Exactly, that.
And as a result of that, you're going to live with this forever.
Well, but that's just a confirmation that the prior decisions were correct.
So
that's really good.
So I should keep my mouth shut. Pat Parento, ex-law professor. So 4F is the issue. Okay, so the point of clarification here is you don't have the authority not to do a rehabilitation. Okay, so that's an act of Congress.
Yes.
If you want to change that, that's an act of Congress. They don't have the authority to do that. Okay, they never did.
Back here in the vest.
Your people per day census, when was that done again, in 2021?
That's 2021. So that's our most recent data is 2021. I know there was some question about, how much was that affected by COVID?
How accurate?
Yeah. So the 2016 data that we had was about 2,200 cars a day. So it's not a huge difference that we saw going back pre-COVID. The 2020 numbers are where we saw the most significant decline.
Has any been done since then, this year?
I don't know.
I've only lived in East Thetford for about 2.5 years. I work at a local insurance agency in Lyme. She works now at a nursery in Lyme. So, I mean, within the last 2 years, I can say that a lot of people have moved here within both sides of the river and in the last 2 years. Actually, the last 1.5 years. And a lot are going to be impacted just by making that quick. So it's about that vehicle per day.
Actually, going along with that, I think based on the amount of vehicles that pass now, once the bridge is at low capacity, how many more vehicles are going to be crossing the bridge, making it unsafe for pedestrians and bicyclists? How much more traffic are we going to see?
Okay, I'm gonna circle back to people that have already spoken. Okay, everyone's pointing at this woman. All right.
A comment and a question. You mentioned that the load for pedestrians, you have to assume that the bridge might be packed with pedestrians for some event and therefore it can't be built. And, we keep large trucks off of the bridge with signs. We can keep however many people shouldn't be on that bridge at one time off the bridge. I mean, we don't have to have rubber ducky, whatever, or canoe races
It would certainly be challenging through the contract. I think the bigger kind of consideration is then that means for everyone that said, how does my fire truck get across for mutual aid, that would be a permanent condition, that you would permanently not be able to drive the fire truck across the bridge. So I think there's a trade-off there that both boards would need to consider how they weigh that. Okay.
Okay.
Repeats.
I'll try to keep it shorter than last time.
Yeah, hi, Donna.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm Bill Keegan, Thetford.
I'm sorry, I didn't see any other hands.
Thank you for your depth of knowledge in presenting. I want to add to this idea about having a pedestrian walkway. Since you're replacing, if I remember correctly, a whole steel beam down the outside, would there be an opportunity to go back and think again about, is it, so it has been figured out that you can't put 2 in to increase the strength, but you don't want to increase the depth to keep the trails over the water.
So these that we're
Yeah.
replacing, that are the deteriorated members,
Yeah.
are not what controls the load carrying capacity. That is carried in the truss itself. So right now, today, it's being controlled by the deteriorated members. Once those are replaced, the controlling member becomes part of the truss itself. So it can carry legal loads, legal traffic loads, but it can't carry pedestrians and legal traffic
Could
loads.
you work from the truss then to come down to the pedestrian bridge?
I'm not sure I'm following.
Well, if the structural members are trusses,
Yeah.
is there a way to work off of those to come down and support the pedestrian instead of coming off of the deck?
It all ultimately, again, I don't want to complex, but it all goes into, like all of the load of the deck, of the cars, ultimately is carried by all of the members that you're seeing here. So some are in compression, some are in tension, we won't get into that, we'll be here all night. But ultimately, there is at least one member in this truss that doesn't have the ability to do both of those things that we're asking it to do. And that would require much more extensive work to accommodate.
I'll back the idea of limiting the possible weight of pedestrians, like not allowing public events that load the whole thing.
All right, I think gentleman over here, yeah. Yep.
My name is David Kahn. I'm a member of the Lyme Select Board. I just wanted to echo my colleague, my Vermont analog, and thanking you for coming into the Lion's Den and express I understand people worked up about some of these issues, but I wanted to express regret for some of the some of the hostility that's infected some of the questions or statements. Thank you for looking after our bridge and fixing it, because personally I'd be really bummed if it was out of circulation for 5 years or 8 years. That wouldn't work for me.
So I have a rebuttal from Liz Cole, who says that Pat is wrong. The state has the ability to find adverse effect, but then determined to demolish anyway. This was done with the Honeydew Bridge in California. Apparently he's stopped his research too soon, so it is in the state's purview to find this adverse effect.
So I think that goes back to what the gentleman that
Correct.
was sitting here spoke to, that, and I think John has mentioned this, we do have an adverse effect on the structure. The work that we're doing is an adverse effect. What we can't do and what we don't have the authority to do is to override the provisions of the 4F, section 4F. So it's not necessarily that we can't have an adverse effect, it's that we have to pick the alternative with the least harm. Okay.
Just in addition to say that live stream has had about 100 additional people watching, so they wanted you all to know.
Okay. All right. Oh, the woman who's
gentleman person that I would like to say.
I just want to add, I'm from Hanover myself, and just when you're saying talking to the two towns, I just request that also be talking to the town folks in Hanover and Norwich and Fairleigh and Orford too, because I think this affects more than just Lyme and Thetford. So just when you're reaching out to the town select boards, include those folks as well.
Okay, there's also been there was a woman over here that you had your hand up for a little while. Are you all set? Yeah.
I just had a comment, and this sort of harks back to something that was said probably 20 minutes ago, so it may not be out of context now. It was talking about a woman that was from here, standing up actually, talked about the environmental impacts to the river of building a bigger bridge. And I just wanted to comment that the river is already horribly environmentally impacted by the Wilder Dam. Like we've got siltation, like you don't know, that the river's become a lake, the banks are being constantly eroded by the slapping of waves. So it's not like it's a pristine environment. I just wanted to make that comment. I'm not going to go any further.
Thank you. So I think we've got our last comment.
Yeah, first apologies, I think probably the hostility is me, and I'm sorry about that. I'm a hothead. I'm also the child of 2 engineers. In fact, my mother was one of the co-founders of the Society of Women Engineers. So I'm raised with sort of like can-do, okay, this is this way, let's make it this way. And so I respect you for being an engineer, by the way. I'm sorry you've only been on the project a short period of time. I trust, given your receptivity, that if you'd come on earlier, we'd be looking at a different bridge. But I'm struck by the fact that when you were talking about, oh, we'd have to do this, we'd have to be a girder bridge, we'd have to put another, whatever it's called, footing in, we'd have to do this. I'm like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And if the issue really is, I also think if you get federal senators involved on the New Hampshire side and hopefully on the Vermont side, those are people who would be, I think, very receptive and very eager to find ways with the money coming out of, Biden's budget. I just think